I'd stopped expecting anyone to look at me twice somewhere around my 33rd birthday, after a decade of putting my own life on hold for someone else's ending. Then a woman with dirt under her fingernails and her dead husband's name still printed on her mailbox walked into my shop holding a broken cider press gear, and something in me that had been quietly asleep for years opened one eye and refused to close it again. My name is Jonah Pruitt. I'm 36, and I run a small machine shop on the edge of Hartwell, Vermont, repairing the kind of equipment that keeps small orchards running: cider presses, tractor parts, the old grafting tools half the farms around here have used for 3 generations. It's steady, unglamorous work. My hands know the inside of an engine better than they know most conversations. That suits me fine, most days. I never set out to live a quiet life. I was 24 when my mother's Parkinson's started taking more than it gave back, and I made the choice, without much deliberation, to move home and care for her instead of finishing the engineering degree I'd been working toward 2 states away. I told myself it would be a year, maybe 2. It was 9. By the time she passed, 2 winters ago, I was 34 years old, and the version of my life I'd once imagined, the wife, the kids, the house full of noise, had quietly drifted so far out of reach, I'd mostly stopped thinking of it as something that was supposed to happen to me at all. I told people I was fine being alone. Mostly, I believed it. The shop kept me busy enough not to notice the quiet too closely. Linnea Voss walked into that quiet on a Thursday afternoon in early October, the orchard behind her family's land in full color, carrying a cracked gear from her cider press like it was something she'd already decided not to hope too much about. "I know this is probably beyond saving," she said, setting it on my counter, "but the press is older than I am, and Daniel always said you could fix anything with enough patience." I picked up the gear, turned it over, recognized the model immediately. "Daniel Voss?" "My husband." She said it the way people say a word they've practiced not flinching at. "He passed 18 months ago. Tractor accident." I'd heard about it, the way you hear about things in a town this size. Quietly. Secondhand. The particular silence that follows a young man's death in a community where everyone farms the same stretch of hillside. I hadn't connected the name to a face until that moment, hadn't known the widow everyone spoke of carefully was the same woman now standing in my shop with paint-stained jeans and an expression so carefully composed it looked like it cost her something to hold. "I'm sorry," I said, because there wasn't really a better thing to say. "I can fix this. Give me a few days." She nodded, something in her shoulders loosening slightly, the way people relax when one small thing in a difficult week turns out to be manageable. "Thank you. The orchard doesn't run without that press, and harvest doesn't wait for grief. Apparently nothing waits for grief, as it turns out." She left without elaborating further, climbing into a pickup truck that still had a faded Voss family orchard decal on the door, and I stood there in my shop a long moment after she'd gone, holding a broken gear and feeling something stir in me that I didn't yet have a name for. What I didn't know that afternoon, watching her truck disappear down the dirt road toward the orchard, was how much of herself she'd buried alongside her husband, or how long it would take me to understand that fixing a cider press was the easiest thing either of us would do that year. The gear took me 4 days, longer than it should have, though if I'm honest with myself, I drew the repair out a little. Found small reasons to take my time, telling myself it was thoroughness and not a reluctance to have a reason to see her stop coming by. She picked it up on a Monday, and this time she lingered, watching me reassemble the press's internal mechanism on the counter before I handed it over, asking questions about the gear ratios with a genuine curiosity that surprised me, given how little most people around here cared about the mechanics behind their equipment. "Daniel used to do all this himself," she said, watching my hands work. "I never learned. I always figured I had time to learn eventually." "You can learn now," I offered. "I don't mind teaching." She looked up at that, something cautious moving across her face, like the offer had landed somewhere more complicated than I'd intended it to. "I'm not sure I'm ready to learn things he used to know." "It feels like." She stopped herself, shook her head slightly. "Never mind. Thank you for fixing it." She left before I could ask what she'd been about to say, and I spent longer than I should have that evening thinking about the particular weight in her voice, The sense that she was carrying something far heavier than one broken cider press gear. Something I had no business asking about yet, not from a woman I'd known less than a week. Over the following month, she found reasons to come by the shop more often than the orchard's actual equipment needs probably justified. A question about winterizing the press, a tractor part that could have waited until spring, a grafting tool that needed sharpening but not urgently. I noticed and didn't say anything, content to let whatever this was unfold at whatever careful pace she needed. I learned, in pieces, the shape of her life before Daniel. She'd grown up 2 towns over, met him at a county fair when she was 19, married into the Hartwell Orchard name, and spent 12 years building a life on that hillside that she genuinely loved. Right up until the October morning a rolled tractor took it all away in the space of an afternoon. She had no children, a fact she mentioned once, carefully, like she was testing whether I'd treat it as a tragedy or simply a fact, and seemed relieved when I did neither. Just nodded and let the silence hold it without comment. What she didn't mention, not for weeks, was Eleanor. I learned about Eleanor Voss, Daniel's mother, the way I learned most things about Linnea's life, sideways, in pieces, while we were doing something else entirely. Eleanor still lived in the original farmhouse on the property, had handed the working orchard down to Daniel and Linnea years before his death, but never quite let go of her sense of ownership over the place. Or, it became clear, over what kind of widow her son's wife was supposed to be. I met Eleanor for the first time on a cold afternoon in November, dropping off a sharpened tool at the orchard myself, instead of waiting for Linnea to come collect it. Eleanor was in the yard hanging laundry despite the cold, a tall, sharp-eyed woman who looked at me with an assessment so immediate and thorough I felt evaluated before I'd said a single word. "You're the machine shop man," she said, not quite a question. "Jonah Pruitt." "Ma'am." "I know who you are." She kept pinning laundry, not quite looking at me now. "I also know my daughter-in-law has been finding excuses to visit your shop more than this orchard's equipment requires." I didn't have a ready answer for that, and my silence apparently told her everything she needed to know, because she finally turned to face me fully, something fierce and grief worn in her expression. "My son has been gone 18 months, Eleanor said. 18 months, Mr. Pruitt. I buried him on a Tuesday in April, and some days I still walk past his old workshop expecting to hear him in there. I am not interested in watching this town quietly decide it's time for Linnea to move on, as though my son is some chapter she's allowed to simply close. I'm not trying to close any chapters, Mrs. Voss," I said carefully. "I'm just fixing equipment." Eleanor's eyes were sharp, unconvinced, though something underneath the sharpness looked more like fear than anger. "See that it stays that way." She turned back to her laundry, the conversation clearly finished, and I drove back to the shop with that exchange sitting heavy in my chest, understanding for the first time that whatever was quietly building between Linnea and me wasn't going to be a simple thing. Not with a grieving mother standing watch over her son's memory like the last fortress she had left to defend. What I didn't fully understand yet, driving back down that hillside road, was how much of my own fear was standing in the way too. Not Eleanor's fear, but mine. The old, careful instinct that had kept me single and cautious for a decade. The part of me that wondered, quietly, whether a man who'd spent his best years caring for an ending had any business asking a grieving widow to consider a beginning. The conversation that finally cracked something open between us happened on an ordinary Tuesday in late November, the orchard's bare branches stark against an early snow, Linnea sitting on an overturned crate in my shop, while I worked on a part that didn't really need her supervision, the way she'd started doing most weeks by then. "Eleanor talked to you," she said. Not a question. I set down my tools. "She did." "I'm sorry, she means well. She's just..." Linnea exhaled slowly. "She's terrified that if I'm allowed to be happy again, it means Daniel didn't matter as much as he did." I understand it. I think some days I believe the same thing about myself. "What do you mean?" She was quiet for a long moment, turning a stray bolt over in her hands. And when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something rawer than I'd heard from her before. "I buried my husband, Jonah, and somewhere in that same ground I think I buried my heart with him." I haven't let myself want anything since. Not really. Not the way I think you might be starting to want something. She looked up at me then, eyes bright, vulnerable in a way that cost her something to show. I don't know how to dig that part of myself back up. I'm not sure I'm allowed to. I'm not sure I even remember how. I felt the weight of that land in my chest, recognized in it something close to my own decade of quiet, careful avoidance, the particular grief of a life spent tending someone else's ending until you forget you're allowed a beginning of your own. You don't have to dig it all up at once, I said quietly. I'm not asking for the whole thing, Linnea. I've spent 10 years standing very still myself, taking care of an ending instead of letting myself want a beginning. I understand what it costs to feel buried under something you didn't choose. Then, what are you asking for? Her voice was barely above a whisper now. I held her gaze, steady, sure of this one thing even as the rest of it felt uncertain. Then let me dig just a little. Not the whole grave, Linnea, just enough to see if there's still something underneath that wants to grow. She made a small, broken sound, something between a laugh and a sob, and didn't pull away when I reached for her hand. The shop quiet around us except for the soft tick of a cooling engine and the first hush of snow falling outside the window. We didn't kiss that day. It felt too soon, too fragile, the kind of thing that needed to be built slowly instead of rushed into. But when she finally drove back up the hillside toward the orchard, I stood in my shop doorway watching her taillights disappear into the snow, and I understood that something in both of us had just shifted, even if neither of us was ready yet to call it by its name. There was a particular afternoon in mid-November that I kept returning to later, turning it over the way you turn over something you want to keep. Harvest was winding down, the last of the late-season apples needing to come off the trees before the first hard frost, and Linnea had mentioned, almost in passing, that she was short-handed that week. I showed up at the orchard the next morning before my shop even opened, work gloves already in my truck, and spent the day picking apples alongside her in cold, bright air that smelled like cider and wood smoke. "You don't have to keep showing up like this," she said around midday, the two of us sitting on the tailgate of her truck eating sandwiches, breath fogging between sentences. "I know," I said, the same two words I kept finding myself saying to her. "I want to." She studied me for a long moment, an apple half eaten in her hand. "Why? You could be at your shop making actual money instead of freezing out here for free." I thought about how to answer that honestly, the way I'd been slowly learning to with her. Because I spent 10 years showing up for someone whose life was ending, and somewhere along the way I forgot what it felt like to show up for something that was actually still growing. This orchard's growing, Linnea. So are you. Even on the days you don't believe it yet. She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't look away either, and we finished the rest of the harvest in a comfortable, unhurried quiet that felt like its own kind of conversation. That evening, she invited me in for hot cider before I drove back down the hill, the two of us sitting at her kitchen table, while the wood stove ticked and settled, and she finally asked me the question I think she'd been working up to for weeks. "What was it like?" she asked. "Caring for your mother all those years." I don't ask because I'm trying to compare it to my grief. I ask because I think you're the only person I know who actually understands what it's like to lose the version of your life you thought you were going to have. I turned my mug slowly in my hands, surprised at how easily the words came once she'd asked plainly, instead of letting me dance around it. It was the hardest and most ordinary thing I've ever done. Some days it was just helping her stand up from a chair. Some days it was sitting with her at 3 a.m. because the medication wasn't working, and she was scared and didn't want to be alone. I loved her completely, and some days I also hated my own life so much I could barely stand to be in it. Both things were true at once. I think that's the part nobody warns you about, that grief and love and resentment can all live in the same house without canceling each other out. Linnea's eyes were bright in the lamplight. "That's exactly it," she said quietly. "That's exactly what I haven't been able to explain to anyone. I loved Daniel completely, and some days I'm so angry at him for dying that I can barely breathe, and I feel guilty for the anger, so I just push all of it down instead and call it grief. Because grief feels like the only acceptable thing to admit to." "You're allowed all of it," I said, "not just the parts that look respectable from the outside." She reached across the table then and took my hand. The first time she'd initiated that particular gesture instead of simply allowing it. And something settled into place between us that night that neither of us tried to name yet, but that both of us, I think, already understood. What I didn't know yet, walking back to my truck under a sky full of more stars than the season usually allowed, was how soon that fragile, unnamed thing between us would be tested by more than just Eleanor's grief. December brought harder weather and harder conversations. Eleanor's quiet disapproval sharpened into something more direct once it became clear that Linnea and I weren't simply friends who shared an interest in cider press maintenance. She started showing up at the orchard whenever I was there, finding small tasks that required Linnea's attention elsewhere, mentioning Daniel's name with deliberate frequency in a way that felt less like grief and more like a campaign. "She means well," Linnea kept saying. The same defense, though I noticed it growing thinner each time she offered it. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks before Christmas, when Eleanor found us in the orchard's old equipment barn, Linnea laughing at something I'd said, a sound I'd come to recognize as rare and precious. The kind of laugh that had clearly been buried under grief for longer than either of us had said out loud. Eleanor's face, when she saw us, went through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, something that looked almost like longing, and finally, settling, a brittle anger that had clearly been building for weeks. "You're laughing," Eleanor said to Linnea, the words landing strange and sharp in the quiet barn. In here, of all places. Daniel built half these shelves himself. Linnea's laughter died instantly, replaced by the careful, guarded composure I recognized from the day we'd first met. "Eleanor, I'm not trying to upset you," Eleanor continued, though her voice suggested otherwise, grief and anger tangled together in a way that made the words come out harder than she probably intended. "I just don't understand how quickly the world expects a wife to forget. 18 months, Linnea. 18 months and already there's laughter in my son's workshop. Already there's a man's hand on your back like he has any right to it." "He has every right to it," Linnea said, and something in her voice had shifted. Steadier now than I'd heard it, like Eleanor's words had finally pushed her past the careful deference she'd been offering for months. "Daniel is gone, Eleanor. I loved him. I will always have loved him. But he is gone, and I am still here, and I don't know how to keep apologizing to you for the simple fact of still being alive." Eleanor's face crumpled, the anger finally giving way to the grief underneath it. "I lost my son," she said, voice breaking. "You're the only piece of him I have left. The only connection to who he was. And every day you move further from that, I feel him slipping away a little more too. I know that's not fair to put on you. I know it. I just don't know how to stop being afraid of losing him all over again." The barn went quiet, snow ticking softly against the old tin roof, and I watched something pass between the two women that I understood I had no real place in. A particular grief that belonged to them, mother and widow, bound together by the same loss and now, slowly, being pulled apart by it too. I stepped back, giving them space, but Linnea reached for my hand without looking away from Eleanor, a small, deliberate gesture that said more than words could have. "You're not losing him, Eleanor," Linnea said, gentler now. "He's not in this barn, or in my grief, or in how long I wait before I let myself be happy again. He's in every story we still tell about him. He's in the orchard he loved. He's in the part of me that's better for having loved him. None of that disappears just because I let someone else stand beside me too." Eleanor didn't answer right away, but something in her shoulders eased, the brittle anger finally cracking into something more honest. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly. "I'm an old woman who's already buried her husband and her only son, and I don't know what's left for me if I lose my place in your life too." "You won't lose your place," Linnea said. "You're his mother. That doesn't change. But I can't keep shrinking my whole life down to fit inside your grief, Eleanor. I have to be allowed mine too, whatever shape it takes next." It wasn't a complete resolution, not in the space of one difficult conversation in a cold barn, but it was honest in a way the months before it hadn't been, and I watched something begin, slowly to soften between them that hadn't been there before. The practical edge of Eleanor's fear surfaced again in January, in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with paperwork. Linnea discovered, going through the orchard's records to prepare for tax season, that Eleanor's name was still listed alongside hers on the deed. A detail from the original transfer years before that nobody had ever bothered to update. And that gave Eleanor, technically, equal say in any major decisions about the property's future. She could block anything, Linnea told me one evening, spreading the paperwork across my workbench, frustration tight in her voice. New equipment, expanding the orchard, even something as small as which contractor we hire for the spring planting. I've been running this place alone for 2 years, and on paper, I still need her permission. I didn't offer to fix it the way I might have once, with a quick solution that skipped past the harder conversation underneath. Have you told her that's how it's affecting you? No, Linnea admitted. I've been too afraid it would feel like one more thing I'm taking from her. It was Linnea herself, in the end, who brought the deed to Eleanor's kitchen table. Not as an accusation, but as an honest question. Did Eleanor want to keep equal legal say in a property she'd handed over years ago? Knowing what that meant for Linnea's ability to build a future there. The conversation was hard, the two of them sitting across from each other with the paperwork between them like one more piece of Daniel. Neither wanted to be the one to set down. But Eleanor, to her credit, surprised us both. She signed the transfer the following week, no longer needing the legal claim, she said, now that she trusted what was actually growing on that hillside. I think I needed the paper to feel like I still belonged here, Eleanor admitted, the day she signed it, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. I'm starting to understand I belong here regardless of what the deed says. That small, unglamorous resolution mattered more, I think, than the conversation in the barn had. Proof that grief could be honored without it costing Linnea her own future. And proof, for Eleanor, that letting go of one kind of claim didn't mean losing her place at the table. What I understood, standing in that barn watching two grieving women find their way back toward each other, was that my own fear, the quiet, careful conviction that I had no business asking a widow to want a beginning when I'd spent a decade tending only endings, had been just as much an obstacle as anything Eleanor had ever said out loud. I'd been so certain I needed permission to want something good again that I'd nearly let that certainty cost me the very thing I wanted. I found Linnea alone in the orchard a few days later, walking the bare rows under a sky heavy with more snow. And I finally said the thing I'd been circling since that afternoon in my shop weeks before. I've spent 10 years telling myself I didn't deserve to want anything for myself, I said, falling into step beside her. First because my mother needed every piece of me, and after she passed because I'd gotten so used to being the one who tends to other people's endings that I forgot how to ask for a beginning of my own. I watched you and Eleanor in that barn, both of you so certain you didn't have the right to want something different than the grief you'd already accepted, and I realized I'd been making the exact same mistake. Linnea stopped walking, turning to face me fully, snow beginning to drift down around us. What are you saying, Jonah? I'm saying I don't want to keep standing carefully at the edge of this, waiting for permission that's never going to feel like enough, I said. I know you buried your heart with Daniel. I know some days it still feels safer to leave it there, but I'm asking you to let me help dig. Even if it's slow, even if some days you're not sure there's anything left underneath to find. Her eyes were bright with tears now, the snow catching in her hair. What if there isn't? What if I dig and there's nothing left under there but grief? Then we'll find that out together, I said. But I don't believe that's true, Linnea. I've watched you laugh in a barn your husband built. I've watched you ask questions about gear ratios just so you'd have a reason to stay another half hour. That's not a woman with nothing left underneath. That's a woman who's been too afraid to let it surface. She closed the distance between us then, snow falling soft and silent around the bare orchard rows, and kissed me with a kind of careful, deliberate courage that told me everything her words hadn't quite managed to say yet. The months that followed weren't simple, but they were honest in a way that mattered more than simple ever could have. Eleanor didn't transform overnight into an easy presence in our lives, but something had shifted in that barn. Some old fear finally named out loud, and made smaller for the naming. She started inviting me to Sunday dinners, gruffly, like the invitation cost her something, and by spring, she'd taken to setting an extra place at the table without being asked. no longer treating my presence as an intrusion on her son's memory but as something the orchard itself seemed to have quietly made room for. Linnea began teaching herself the mechanics Daniel used to handle, not because she felt obligated to fill his exact role, but because she discovered, somewhere in our long afternoons in my shop, that she genuinely enjoyed understanding how things worked. I taught her gear ratios and tractor maintenance, and she taught me, in turn, the particular rhythm of orchard work, the patience required to wait a full season for proof that something you'd planted was actually going to grow. We were married the following autumn, almost exactly 2 years after Daniel's death, in the orchard itself, under trees heavy with the season's apples. The cider press Linnea had brought to my shop that first October running steadily in the background, pressed by Eleanor herself, who'd insisted on it, saying it felt right that Daniel's old machine should have a part in the day too. I said my vows looking right at Linnea, the words I'd spoken to her in that snowy orchard rising back up, truer now than they'd even been then. You told me once you buried your heart with Daniel, I said. I told you I just wanted to dig a little. I think what I didn't understand yet, standing there in the snow, was that grief and love aren't actually opposites, fighting over the same ground. They can grow in the same soil, the way these orchard rows hold both the trees your husband planted and the ones we've planted together this past year. I don't want you to forget him. I never did. I just wanted room to grow something alongside what he left behind. Eleanor, seated in the front row, wept openly through the entire ceremony, no longer fighting the tears the way she once might have. And when Linnea passed her on the way back down the aisle, she reached for Eleanor's hand without breaking stride. A small, steady gesture that said everything about how far both women had traveled together. That night, after the orchard had emptied of guests and the cider press had gone quiet again, Linnea and I sat on the same overturned crate where she'd first told me about burying her heart, the orchard dark and still around us, snow not yet fallen but close in the cold autumn air. "Do you ever think about that first afternoon?" she asked. "How close I came to just picking up the repaired gear and never finding a reason to come back?" "All the time," I admitted. "I think about how carefully you set that broken piece on my counter, like you'd already decided not to hope too much about it. What made you take your time fixing it?" "Be honest." I thought about it, though I already knew the answer, had known it from the very first moment her truck disappeared down that dirt road. Something told me it wasn't really about the gear. She laughed softly, leaning into me, the orchard quiet and full around us in a way it hadn't been in years, holding both an old grief and a new beginning in the same soil, the way Eleanor's trees still bore fruit every season, regardless of how many winters had passed between them. She'd told me once that she'd buried her husband and her heart with him, certain there was nothing left worth digging for. I'd spent every season since proving, one careful afternoon at a time, that grief doesn't have to be the only thing left standing in a life. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let someone else help turn the soil. And trust that something new is still allowed to grow there, right alongside everything that came before.